Hello and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar on best practice approaches for corporate actions automation. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor at A-Team Group and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Neil Shepherd, Global Head of Business Development Asset Servicing at SmartStream, Maureen Gallagher, Head of Enterprise Reference Data at Bloomberg, Tom Bistany, Associate Director, Trade Support and Corporate Actions at RBC Capital Markets, Kerry White, Independent Advisor and Corporate Actions Specialist, formerly JP Morgan and BNY Mellon, and Judith Kidane-Taggart, Head of Global Custody Product Development for Portfolio Services at BNY Mellon. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in a couple of minutes, but first just a few notes for you. Looking at your screens to the right of your video, you have a panel for questions and a panel for polls. We'll be running 3 poll questions throughout the webinar, and if you'd like to take part, please just place your votes there, and it'd be great if you did, because then we can gauge your interest and where you are in terms of corporate actions. In the questions box, please feel free to type any questions you'd like me to put to our speakers. We'll do that as we go along and not wait till the end. So at least we can get some in before we run out of time. So place your questions there and we'll put as many as we can to our speakers. That's it from me. So let me come to our speakers. And Neil, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest in corporate actions.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Hello, everybody. My name is Neil Shepherd. I'm the Global Head of New Business for Asset Servicing at SmartStream. For my sins, I've been involved with corporate actions for the best part of 25 years. So as a buyer of solutions in operations, and also in the last 15 years or so, providing solutions to the marketplace. So very happy to be involved today.
Lovely, thank you. Maureen, over to you.
Thank you. Excited to be here today. Maureen Gallagher. I lead all of our reference data products at Bloomberg, specifically our enterprise data products. From a corporate actions perspective, prior to taking on an expanded role managing all products, I managed our corporate actions data feeds. So and worked across our global data department. So I'm very excited for this dialogue and discussion today. Thank you.
And over to you, Tom.
Hi, thank you for having me today. So I'm been with RBC for about almost 9 years. Of just 3 of that has actually been with the asset servicing or corporate action space. So I'm sort of the newcomer of the group to the space, but a lot of my my focus now is really based on asset servicing, and I guess my perspective on it is more of a like the front business facing perspective, because I've traditionally been in more of trade support roles and managing trade support teams, interacting with the business from a more front and middle office perspective. So I bring a lot of that to the table with my asset servicing approach as well.
Thank you. Kerry. I think you're on mute, Kerry.
Got it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. No problem.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. This is a great panel of colleagues, I would say. Interestingly enough, I have spent many years in the asset servicing space, primarily catering towards asset owners. So I kind of have a slightly different perspective than some of the other panelists here. In addition to spending many years in the custody space, prior to that, I ran the back office of a fixed income boutique. So I've also been not only somebody helping to piece together, the puzzle pieces of keeping the corporate actions data flowing. I've been a consumer of a variety of different types of reference data over the years. So thank you again for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Kerry. And Judith, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm currently serving as the global head of custody product development for portfolio services at BNY Mellon. And under the portfolio service umbrella includes corporate actions, income, proxy, and class action services. And so I've been in that role for the last 3 months. So it's a very new opportunity for me. But prior to that, I spent 15 years in security services, where I served in several roles across product, marketing, sales and trading, and operations at JP Morgan in the equity markets derivatives organization. So thanks again. Happy to be here. And excited for conversation.
Thank you all very much indeed. So let's get on with that conversation. But first, let's run a quick audience poll. The question is, to what extent is your organization confident in the correctness of its corporate actions processing? So while you have a think about that and answer the question, let me come to Neil to set the scene and tell us a little bit about what is happening in the corporate action space at the moment and how he sees it evolving. Neil, you need to unmute.
There you go. Sorry.
Thanks. No problem.
First attempt. Yeah, interesting times. So the demand for corporate action automation is high. Okay. It's a definite post-pandemic spike. You know, I've been in the market, as I said, for quite a while, and it's definitely up there. The interest, the budget, and the real appetite to automate. Okay. The trend is up regarding volumes of corporate action types, and the complexities that are coming along with those corporate actions. That's a fact. The number of clients and prospects that we talk to, very much part of what we do is understand their business, and the trend is overwhelming with regard to volumes and complexities. Okay, what we've seen, interestingly, is there have been a great new deal of investors into our markets. So whether that's a pandemic thing, whether people had more time on their hands, or easier access to the internet, I just don't know. But certainly the numbers have increased, and therefore the kind of portfolio, the global portfolios that we're seeing are a lot more diverse. So by default, you've got added complexities to managing those accounts, and of course the corporate actions. Okay, I think one of those burdens is for all of us is to look at the underlying shareholder, make sure we're looking after those guys, and of course with the governance and the control required to look after those clients, the automation and control is just underlined it even further. Okay, activity. We talk to the clients about the corporate action events. We talk about what is really the sticky points, and overwhelmingly again it's client service. So we've got the risk, we've got everything else behind it, but what they're seeing more and more is the demand from their clients internally and externally for real-time information, access to that information, and guess what, on mobile devices and all that good stuff. So that's another new thing that we've seen coming on board. Just mentioned just now, I think another interesting point, and we are addressing this, and maybe it's a long conversation to be had outside of this forum, but more and more on the agenda, we're being asked about proxy voting and securities class actions. Okay, class actions, my goodness me, billions of dollars go unclaimed, and the allocation of those funds is a real demand coming our way, and something that we are addressing. One other thing that I've noticed, so again, post-pandemic, coming into the markets, whereas before there was an element of caution around hosting and managed service, that's kind of gone. There was some nervousness before. There was some caution about, do we go on premise, do we go hosting? I'll tell you now that everyone's saying, I need a hosted service. Okay, it's either hosted or a managed service, and very rarely, probably due to jurisdiction, do we get a demand for an on-premise installation. So again, post-pandemic, not just with the spike in the activity and the corporate action events, but that demand to have a solution hosted. I think the infrastructure was good, but clients need that control and governance from a hosted perspective. That's kind of my take on where we are at the minute.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. What would you say on that? How are you seeing it from the Bloomberg's perspective?
Thank you. So I'll take a minute just to talk about what we're seeing just from a volume perspective. First, I would start off echoing what Neil has said from a complexity perspective, specifically driven on the back of M&A activity. What we have seen over the last year and what we're seeing this year is that the total, according to our data, we've seen the total volume of US deals announced in mid-October of this year has surpassed the full year of 2020. And we still have a few months left this year. And some of that has been driven by different factors. We've definitely seen an increase driven on the back of SPAC activity kicking off this year. But it's not just from an M&A perspective, it's also just generally speaking from an increase in dividend payments, especially coming out where many dividends were being canceled during the pandemic or omitted during that time. We're now seeing that start to come back, especially with the higher volume of special dividend payments. And not only from an equity distribution perspective, but also within fixed income, a real increase in redemptions and refinancing that has happened at historic levels. Although volumes of new issuance are down this year versus what we saw last year, they're still up significantly over the last few years from a pure volume perspective. So as we continue to see that volume, that introduces new challenges, one from just automation, but also increased complexity as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So heading into our webinar, this is going to be tough. So let's see what our audience thinks. Okay, that's good to see. Good to see. Neil, would you like to make a quick comment on those poll results?
Well, it is great to see. I think, it's proven by working remotely that, tech does work. There's always been a kind of stigma attached to corporate actions that, yes, the expertise is with the individual. You always need that, but, gaining that kind of 80-20% solution automated is real, and it happens. So, yeah, I like that.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And bringing in Tom and Kerry, and coming to you first, Tom, what is the importance of tracking increasing volumes of corporate actions in terms of regulation, operations, and business process?
Sure. I think, some of it probably, like many things, when it comes to like metrics and tracking of volumes, anything where you're especially seeing increases like we are, as Neil and Maureen stated, volumes this year are more unprecedented. You obviously need to allocate your resources accordingly, and sort of be proactive. I think allocating those resources inherently then impacting risk, whether it's you're servicing clients or a business or from either a broker dealer or custody perspective, you need to be able to be agile enough to address that risk. And you also need to make sure that you have good understanding of what those events are that are coming your way. If you're looking at a sort of like 20% manual, 80% automated, as you said, that 20% can grow pretty significantly. And having the users have the proper understanding of each event and ability to address them quick enough really requires some agile resource allocation. I think overall you need to be flexible, and it's all about, for me, it's always front facing risk is the idea. And I think from an automation perspective, it's almost a approach of automate and sort of trust, but then verify that information, rather than sort of making too much of it manual. I think volumes can get away from you if too much of it is manual. So I think automation is pretty necessary, and you'll know how to address that with the volume tracking.
Okay, that's great. We'll come back to automation a little bit later on. And Kerry, let me bring you in here. How do you see this, the importance of tracking these large volumes and increasing volumes?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I think Neil and Maureen did a great job of setting the scene, so thanks for that. In terms of volumes and the importance of tracking those volumes, I would echo Tom's sentiments. My first thought is from an operations perspective, because ensuring that you have adequate and knowledgeable staff to meet the demand of processing these corporate actions should be a very high priority. As Tom just said, you need to trust, but you also need to verify. So, I mean, there's always a manual element to that. So I think that's, making sure you have a great staff to be able to understand what these corporate actions are, what they mean, the entitlements, et cetera, is important. As much as we've all been seeking, the holy grail of 100% straight through processing, the fact of life is we aren't there, and manual intervention is still required. So I think, just to follow on from Tom's comments, I think improving the efficiency of the handling of corporate actions can do a number of things, including potentially to help cut costs, minimize, compromised data, and hopefully provide a form of competitive advantage, which I think Neil alluded to, in terms of, providing better client service, if you will, to your end clients, be they asset managers or asset owners. And I think it goes without saying that maintaining regulatory compliance is always a top priority, especially for the banks, the custodians, but all market participants. And I think that in and of itself also generally helps to lead to reduced operational and reputational risks.
Okay, let's take another audience poll to question how it's going with automation, or at least what the problems are. And the question, therefore, is what are the data and data management challenges of successfully automating corporate actions processing at your organization? So while you think about that one, and you can tick as many boxes as you feel are appropriate, let me come to you, Deet, to see how you see the challenges of tracking and automating increasing volumes of corporate actions.
Sure, thank you for that. So corporate actions, as we all know, they're not standardized. They are consistently changing and more getting creative. And when you overlay that with the optionality that's given to our shareholders on how they want to process the corporate actions, and then in addition to the dynamic nature of the changing positions, especially over key dates, and then tax requirements, that is a significant amount of extraneous data detail that's not standardized today. And even when you apply the use of, let's say, AI or machine learning, it's really difficult to apply that technology to disparate or free text fields. So it's really hard to extract the value there. And so with that, there's a high amount of both implicit and explicit risk due to the lack of non-standardization. And to that, we do have industry forums that we participate to help mitigate that risk, such as ITSE, right? But we know that ITSE's main focus right now is the standardization and enhancing of Swift messaging. And then we have SIFMA, but that's very much broker-dealer focused. And then there are the global custody operations forums, which have an enormous amount of information and a great source of, subject matter expertise. But in those forms, without engagement from our issuers, right, it really makes it difficult, if not impossible, to really enact those changes to overcome those hurdles and challenges in automating certain corporate actions. So I think with that, I laid out all of like our potential hurdles, and with that, I don't want to leave it just there. So I think that with that said, I certainly think there's a market opportunity, right, for corporate actions to have an industry forum that solely focuses on corporate action standardization, similar to what the market has today for, let's say, like exchange listed option products, right, where we have the OCC, which in most respects is a clearinghouse, but in that clearinghouse, they establish very strict rules or standardization rules that is governed by them for how option products are processed, from announcement of the product to notification of timelines, and also processing and election deadlines. So I think it's a really exciting time now with really the heightened focus on corporate actions. Obviously because all of the risk, the potential financial risk, but also with, again, corporate actions now becoming more and more creative, particularly in the class action space and proxy, where these two, what we're calling, what we maybe see as like standard processing, are turning into assets as themselves, right? These offerings. So I think, really what's key for us to getting over these challenges is having a centralized industry globally that really just focuses on standardizing these guidelines from, all the way from a global custodial perspective to both, global custodial, to the broker dealer, to the client, and more importantly, the issuer. Right, because I think these are the four key players, and there's many more. But standardization amongst those four key stakeholders, I think, really will help mitigate a lot of those challenges or risks around managing all of the corporate action, increasing volumes, and all of the changes that come through.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. From your perspective, how do you see the data management challenges and the data challenges?
Sure, and I think it echoes what we just heard. And when we think about volume, frequency, complexity, it makes it very difficult to scale. And it's always challenging for any data management process to maintain speed, accuracy, and scale. Typically, you can do two really well, but the third one can become a challenge. And, but unfortunately in the corporate action space, it's not an option. You have to maintain the speed, accuracy, and scale, or the impact of that is too great. And as we continue to see a push for automation, expectations around timeliness just continue to tighten. In the past, what could have been within that announced day or hours of the announcement is no longer acceptable for many of what we're seeing from our customers. They're really looking, especially for certain event types, within minutes, if not, down to seconds of that initial announcement, to trigger all of the workflows that have been discussed so far and will continue to discuss. So I think, due to the impact of incorrect corporate actions, and as well due to the integration of corporate actions, not just from an operations perspective, but also from an integration across the entire workflow, from the front, middle, and back office, the need for timely corporate action data is critical, and the need for consistent data across those workflows are also critical. So we continue to see a pressure and need for standardization as far as enhancing and maintaining the data standards that can be offered to support that, because the more complex we see a direct correlation to what is, a free text or descriptive nature that start to break any automated process. So all of those challenges come together and make it very difficult, but also a very great opportunity for continuing to improve what can be done here.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see what our audience is saying on challenges. Thank you. Ah, yes, the usual old chestnut. Maureen, would you like to comment on those results? Can you see the results, Maureen? Perhaps you can't.
Yes, sorry, just
no, that's fine. Just taking them in. Sure, no problem.
Just taking it in. I mean, yes, I think having poor data quality directly impacts every workflow we've discussed so far, and the challenge of I think it really ties back to volumes, speed, and accuracy, and they all end up as one increases, it can cause a challenge on the other. So I think that this speaks directly to why we're here today and why there's an opportunity to continue improving what can be done from an automation of corporate actions perspective.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. And we're going to run one last poll for today. And this one is the telling one. To what extent has your organization actually automated corporate actions processing? So please go ahead and vote on that one while I come back to Kerry to talk about best practice approaches firms can follow to automate corporate actions processing and how then they are dealing with exceptions.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think the best practices dictate that one needs to recognize that in terms of the corporate actions lifecycle itself, there's several distinct elements that require addressing when tackling any automation program. And I think we've heard from the practitioners here about some of those issues. But I think in terms of when you are thinking about the life cycle, obviously there are a number of key elements. Event management, Maureen was just speaking about that, and the accelerated timelines that are coming along with that. The management of positions, position management, election management, and then of course entitlement calculation and the posting of those corporate actions. I think in terms of at least some of the organizations where I've worked and I've consulted with, the firms are often burdened with a number of legacy systems, and that in and of itself it creates a bit of a burden. And it can also create a hiccup, if you will, where there's a handoff from one platform to another, which could create a break, and that leads to exceptions and potential losses, et cetera. So I think one thing that I've seen a lot of in my career is that making sure when you do have those breaks, you have a good documentation process for what happened in terms of creating the breaks and finding ways to create, if you can, a more durable handoff. And that's really a big challenge.
Okay, thank you. Tom, what would you say there in terms of approaches to automation?
So I think there's been a lot of good mention, and everyone's kind of touching on aspects of the automation so far. I can kind of continue some of that conversation. So like we said initially, to sort of trust but verify. Obviously, as Carrie mentioned, not everything is completely able to be automated. I mean, there's manual aspects to election gathering and submission and items like that, but I think from a vast majority, it's important to try and push for the automation. And then I found coming back and verifying that those things took place in the way you intended them to is an easier thing than actually pushing them manually yourself. I also think it's important, and I've trying to stress this a lot in my career, to sort of industrialize your solutions or look for the most scalable approach, as Maureen mentioned. It's important to create something that has like a team of support around it, and don't get too bootstrapping in your solutions. Otherwise, like that, industry can change and processes can evolve and people can change, and then it can get away from you. So it's an industrialization or having that support team is very critical. I also think some of what Yodit mentioned was actually very interesting, because while like centralization of data and things is going to be critical for true automation, but there are a lot of resources available today that I think people can use, like OCC that she mentioned. They're very transparent in how they operate, and they actually publish a lot of data that I don't think a lot of people are aware of for managing those listed derivatives. So I think, it's always good to see what you have available to you today, rather than thinking that you need to, jump to a bigger solution that's bigger and better. Start with what you have available now and build from there. And if you can get to one sort of like centralized solution one day, that'd be fantastic. But important to remember that not everything necessarily has like the biggest price tag if you kind of get a little creative.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Let's see how our audience is doing. So, wow, 60 to 80%, sorry, 68%, 56% are at the 60 to 80% level. Kerry, would you like to comment on those results?
Sure. I'm actually happily surprised. I think, to see 60 to 80% said that, 56% is well automated. I think it also shows, though, that there's definitely room for improvement. And I think that underscores a lot of what Tom just said. So I think the poll kind of reflects that.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. And let's go on again and come to back to bringing you in, Maureen. How can firms source what we obviously know is needed, high quality, accurate and timely corporate actions data, and how can it be managed, automated and integrated with existing systems?
Sure. I think in what I've seen is really an overall investment in the general data quality and governance process. An understanding of the data sources, a strong announcement workflow so that you have as much time as possible to process events, the ability to track events from that announcement through any future updates, and the rest of the workflow is critical. And when we think about corporate actions, I would definitely echo everything that's been said, but also making sure that a corporate action should be treated like any other security. It should have uniqueness to it. You should be able to track changes that happen when new information becomes available, the impact of that information, when it breaks, that you have a remediation of how that's processed. I know that multiple sources come together to make the completeness of an event, and making sure that there's transparency in where data is coming from, and the same governance policies that many have across all of the other types of data workflows also apply from a corporate actions perspective, and I think are really critical, especially given the increase in volume, and to be able to automate. Without knowing where data is coming from, when it changed, and the impact of those changes, and having transparency into the workflow, you can't, I am very data driven, but you can't make progress on improving something if you can't really measure where it is today. So having the right measurements and workflow, and I really like how, what Tom mentioned earlier about it doesn't have to be, every single component. There are areas to make progress without an entire workflow change. But to do that, you have to understand where it's breaking. And I think that really comes down to the data governance. And when we look at specifically how we can help to manage that volume just of tracking the announcements and news around new corporate actions, we really look to leverage a combination of technology and expertise in that. There are things that you can invest in from a technology perspective, but also expertise. And we really strive to make sure that we can follow the sun to support corporate action. Announcements never stop. And we want to make sure that we have a process that works in place, whether that's, any time of day, to ensure that we can do that. So again, I think it really ties back to the same way that we look at other data sets of having high quality, accurate data is the core to any solution, to be able to automate and integrate within existing systems.
Okay, thank you. Yodi, what would you add there in terms of managing the corporate actions data, of which there is quite a lot?
Right, yeah. So let's kind of like break down the questions first, right? Because there's a couple. So like so the first part of how firms can source high quality data, timely corporate actions data. So I would say the first fundamental practice in prioritizing your primary vendor data source is by understanding how well that vendor performs in that respective market, right? So if you're a global asset servicing offering, your primary vendor source, you could have several, right? Depending on that market. And then equally as important is then always having a second data source, whether it be another vendor or a sub-custodian to validate your primary data source, right? So that's super important in terms of making sure that you really hone in and have a process to ensure that we're providing the most accurate data. And then in terms of timeliness, okay, so as an industry, we're moving from 1502, and I'm sorry, I don't want to get super tactical, but we're, right now as an industry, we're moving from 15022 to 2002 messaging formats, right? And so in that migration to that messaging format, we really as an industry should anticipate opportunities to continue our effort to improve corporate action announcement and election deadlines, just because by sheer nature of moving to this improved messaging format. And then also at BNY specifically, we've seen really great successful stories with our clients in the rollout of emerging API technology, where our clients are when adopting the API technology are essentially not beholden to standard data processing jobs that either happen once a day or 1, 2, 3 times a day. Whereby with leveraging the API capabilities, the BNY Mellon clients are able to pull their respective data on demand where they want it and essentially how they want it, right? And so for them, that drastically reduces the time to market for clients and just overall improving their corporate action client experience. So that's really my view in terms of how firms can source high quality, accurate, and timely corporate action data. Now, in terms of how it can be managed, automated, and integrated with systems, I think, when I think about corporate action platforms, right, or a corporate action application, I don't think it as it is single application. I see a corporate action platform as just that, a platform that hosts a suite of applications, right? And within that platform, you have an application that supports announcement, capture, notification, elections, position and payment booking, right? So like the 4 key fundamentals of corporate action processing. And all of those should be integrated, right? So that you have automation from each hop, right? Because you could build these great applications, but they're not speaking to each other, you lose all value, right? You lose a ton of value if they're not automated and speaking to one another. And then most importantly is as you have this platform of applications that all speak to one another, executing the core functions, you really need an exception and task management and reconciliation layer that sits underneath the core processing applications to ensure that the core application processes are speaking to one another and that we are properly calculating entitlements and balances. And again, without that integration, you lose that automation. And with the loss of automation, there's risk. And then, some may say that this next third component is a nice to have. But I think it's as critical as the first two things that I mentioned with regards to the platform and having exception task management and reconciliation. But the third piece is around having essentially a centralized data lake that really consolidates and reports all of the key reference data inputs that drive the corporate action event and processing. Otherwise, what often you'll see is that you have all of your core processing applications for corporate actions, but if there's something that you have to investigate, like we always do, right? You want to be able to just investigate the drivers of whatever issue or query it is to that corporate action in one central place, as opposed to having to query 10 different applications. So that's really and again, I appreciate what I described may just sound like utopia, but ultimately, that is ultimately my view in terms of, how we can most optimally manage and have an automated corporate action platform with integrated systems.
So just to, it's Neil here. No, it's not my turn, but just to jump in. So where we've seen success, pretty much what you said, where you have that one platform and you break them down into modules and it's workflow and exception driven, that's exactly how it succeeds. And then to your point about APIs,
yeah.
That on the data side or it's on the position side, but the minute you've got the APIs, it takes away or reduces the element of the integration failing. So for what it's worth, I totally agree with that approach, and that is the utopia. That's the target, which we do achieve at times, but that's exactly the way to go. That's exactly it. But integration really can derail a project if you're looking at
utopia is not a place in time. It's a journey, Neil. It's a journey.
Exactly that. So,
okay. Thank you. Let's take a quick break for a couple of audience questions. And Kerry, can I put this first one to you, please? Something you mentioned the corporate actions lifecycle. And this question asks, we've talked about the corporate actions lifecycle and what steps can we take in a large organization with legacy systems and data silos to achieve this? Obviously, always difficult.
Yeah, well, I think what you just described is really probably kind of the answer to that question, trying to, bring these pieces together, the utopian data lake. I think really that is sort of the answer to that question. Maybe she'd like to weigh in.
Okay, that's fine. Great answer. Now, Judith, I have another question. You've mentioned risk a few times, and this one goes, corporate actions raise issues of risk. How best can we mitigate the risk?
So how best can we mitigate the risk of corporate actions? So I'll get to the exception and task management reconciliation platform that I just mentioned, but I really can't stress the importance of the process that's built around ensuring that we have high quality and timely corporate action data, right? That is the crux of everything. If we don't get that right, it all falls over. And so, I've worked at previous places where essentially we had a single primary vendor it was agreed that would be the single primary vendor for all markets. And then we had a secondary source that was carte blanche, that same source. And that doesn't necessarily, and in my experience, that doesn't necessarily work out because as I mentioned, the vendor data sources, performance in certain markets are better than the other. So it's really important to prioritize the performance of the vendor by market. And so with that, again, just reiterating that once you have a really strong place of prioritizing which vendor is good in that respective market, you would undoubtedly need a second source to reconcile that data. Because it doesn't matter, we all know that mistakes happen. So that secondary source, it should be really a perfunctory step. It's not a nice to have, that should be in place. And once you have a robust control process, right? Whoever it sits with, probably in operations or some corporate actions or reference data corporate actions, you need a robust operating control process to actually make sure that if there are any exceptions in that reconciliation, that there's an operating and a robust business process model to address those exceptions and those reconciliations. So did I answer the question correctly? Because in my loquacious explanation, I was like, wait, did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we're down to quality and timeliness to a great degree. Yeah, getting it right.
Yeah, and then just to echo, Neil's comment on the need for you undoubtedly need to have an exception and task management reconciliation layer or application component that is tied in and integrated into the suite of applications that perform the key corporate action processes. Because in my experience, you can have wonderful 100% STP'd corporate action processing applications. But if your underlying controls to support that, let's say at best you have your underlying controls to support those functions, but they're all manual, it's still extremely risky because we talk about increasing volumes and not having an automated way to identify where breaks are. Ultimately, those, we're talking about, especially at large banks, if I'm just processing events, right? Thousands of events, if not millions of events over the period of a month, and I don't have an automated way to identify where a break may exist, you're essentially leaving individuals with the responsibility to manually tick and tie each line to see where there may be a risk. So I can't stress enough how fundamental it is that whilst you're building out an automated corporate action platform or even an automated piece within that corporate action form, that there needs to be in place also an automated task management and reconciliation platform. Otherwise, all that hard work can easily be undone and within one mistake, right? That gets lost in a manual process that wasn't incorporated or automated as part of your corporate action automation project.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And on these kinds of subjects, Tom, let me come over to you to talk a little bit about the types of technologies, solutions, services, or whatever that can help here.
So I think Yodit said it like exceptionally well with her techniques of sort of like the 4 foundational elements of managing and automating corporate actions. And just as I was thinking it, she called it the utopian model, which is certainly, I think, what we're all aiming for. And I think from like a data perspective, yes, a data lake is ideally like what you're aiming for, right? I think you want your quote unquote golden source, but I think even with your like sourcing excellent data into that data lake, you always have to have that secondary source. And a lot of times that secondary source is inherently becomes a control and becomes a something that you have to manually verify. It's hard to integrate like a secondary source that's actually like automated in a sense, is what I find. One of those being like, for example, like we keep mentioning OCC, which is information that's readily available and free. And sometimes we even see that, they might be servicing the derivative side, but sometimes their information is even faster available than some of the vendors. so I guess the technique and solutions area is really like that secondary source for me has always been critical. But that does kind of end up causing a bit of a manual secondary kind of risk checks in my mind. But I guess in other sort of technology solutions or techniques or services, I think when you're integrating this stuff and you're aiming for that like utopian model, you ideally want to look at system expertise and make sure that you have that on board, make sure the systems are playing nice with one another. Sometimes I find that sort of ends up leading you down two roads. Either you're going a vendor solution strictly with one vendor, say like, okay, well, you would assume that the vendor's solutions play nice with one another, or you're going a proprietary route to give yourself a tailored approach. So it's kind of, pick and choose which model works for you, but yeah, I think that's my take on it.
Thank you. Neil, what would you add there in terms of
Yeah.
tech services, etc.?
Yes, just in general, it's really interesting listening to, yes, text, the answer and the automation, and it is out there and it does work. And I agree about the multiple data sources. Absolutely, you need that comparison. And then if you're paying a custodian for that data service, you've got to keep them on their toes. So absolutely, and that exists. But what I'm hearing all the way through this is moving away a little bit from the tech question, but it's absolutely imperative that you have the SMEs around this process. So yes, we can get the 80 to 90% STP, but what I'm hearing from all you guys is you still need that expertise and experience, the people wrapping around the tech. So I think the tech is there. It's there to be understood. The APIs take care of the normalizing the data coming in, albeit from the data capture department, or going downstream when you're posting to accounting systems. If you design a system with APIs and REST APIs in mind, then that's kind of covered. But it's very interesting to hear how we still need that kind of SME involvement to make sure that not only the requirement's understood, but that requirement is translated to the tech guys so that actually becomes a real live working model. And I agree, all this should be exception and workflow driven. Let the automation take care of everything. It will be configured. It would be back to the point Judith made earlier. From the very off, your bespoke requirements will be taken care of by configuration. Let the automation do the work, and then just the 20% of where it's going to be, the SMEs take care of that by workflow and exception only, and having the ability to draw into those data lakes and other areas so you can actually rectify and complete the process. So the tech is there. It's proven, it's in the market. It's just a question of applying it to your organization. And again, that's where you need to wrap the solution with your SMEs so they understand your business and they translate that for you into a tech solution. That's the kind of way I see it at the moment.
Okay, thank you. A couple of audience questions. We'll take them quickly. We are not running out of time yet, but we have a limitation on our time. So Maureen, can I come to you with a question? And it's getting the information we need is too slow. How can we accelerate this? And I don't think it means all the information. How do you do that?
Sure. So when I mentioned it a little bit earlier, the combination, and I think Neil just echoed that a bit, of technology with expertise. And it's really making sure, our approach has been to try to take in as wide of a funnel of sourcing as we can, from valid, primary sources available, and doing the best to do what we can from an automation perspective, but also having the subject matter experts in place so that the rules of that automation are accurate and correct. So, I really think unfortunately, it's a scale issue. There's no easy way about it. The goal is to take in as much as possible. And I would say from a news and announcement perspective, that funnel is large, and there's no easy way to say it, but that we do our best to take in and not drop anything, so that you have the most accurate information, because one source is not enough to be able to fully reconcile the full details of that event. So speed, unfortunately, right now, I think speed is a combination of the technology and the people. But you can't, with speed, you have to solve the volume challenge. There's no way around it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Neil, a quick one for you. I think you've answered this once, but I want to know why you said what you did. It says, please would the panel advise on whether it's better to do corporate actions processing in-house or through a third-party service? And you talked about managed services.
Yes.
Why do it that way?
Yeah, so my view is going to a vendor. One, you haven't got the tech spend directly. You haven't got the overhead of maintenance of the tech. In theory, if you're going to partner like we do with someone like AWS, you've got cutting edge technology. Okay, so all the upgrade, all the maintenance and performance is taken care of for you. In theory, if you're going to someone who specializes in corporate actions, again, in theory, they've got a diverse and probably large client base that has processed corporate actions and come across everything that we've mentioned today. So for the data capture piece, which vendor do you go for each market, for each event type, the rules that you scrub and the exception management, you've got all that expertise ready for you and laid on a plate. So going through a requirement, not only are you going to showcase your automation, but by default, you're going to impart your experience of, an investment bank, a custodian, a broker dealer, for example, and re-engineer that process as you go through the automation. So that's what I would personally always go external for that reason, those reasons, I should say.
Okay, thank you. Next question I'm going to put to Kerry as a practitioner, and it says, what are the benefits of getting corporate actions right and the penalties of getting it wrong?
Okay, so getting corporate actions right is immensely important to the securities industry and to custodians who are typically handling these on behalf of their asset owner clients and their managers. Improving the efficiency, I think everybody's kind of made some commentary here about improving the efficiency of corporate actions processing. It can do a number of things, including help minimize errors and, of course, the costs associated with those errors and processing those activities, which ultimately, in my opinion, benefits the client and hopefully improves the overall relationship with those clients. In terms of getting it wrong, there are a number of issues and penalties sometimes for getting it wrong, including delayed processing, which a couple of the folks here have already talked about, which could have a financial impact, including losses or write-offs, which of course everybody hates to have. You could also have potential regulatory non-compliance penalties for that as well. So again, getting to the bucks there. Another issue would be the reputational risk. I think, for the asset owner, the asset manager, their custodians, the vendors, it depends on, where the glitch was, right? So reputational risk is not without, a concern there. And then in terms of operational risks, I think they're too numerous to list here, but those obviously are also an issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so a lot to play for here, for sure. So Yodi, can I come to you? And bearing in mind we haven't got a lot of time left, to talk us through sort of somebody or an organization that has done this and moved on to automation.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's going to tie back to some of Neil's comments as well when I go through the examples. But, just to kind of preface everybody, just a bit more context before I jump into my answers. So in my current role, right, I serve as the product development lead for portfolio services, which includes a slew of corporate action products. And I've only been doing that for three months. And prior to that, whilst I was at my previous firm, I did participate in corporate actions very peripherally as kind of like a senior stakeholder on the steering co. That being said, I want to just give everyone context and preface that as kind of, where my view is or how my perspective is into the respective case studies. So there's two case studies I'll kind of give a bit of color into. So the first one is in my previous role, where again I was sitting on the steering committee, and we were essentially building an asset servicing, or what many call now corporate actions engine. And it was being built internally and proprietarily. It's a ton of subject matter expertise within the organization, and both operationally and from a tech perspective. And And the platform existed, the legacy platform existed, albeit it was tied into another platform that did 1,000,001 other functions. So the whole idea was like, how do we decouple asset servicing functionality into its own platform? And so we did it internally. And as you can imagine, the time to market was probably 2 to 3 times slower if we were to go with probably an external vendor. But at the time, the firm was very keen on all technologies being built proprietary. So on the downside, you obviously have a very slow time to market. But on the upside, what was delivered was a very customized product for the business. So, it's the age old story, right? If you're able to get enough time to do it right and it's not rushed, it's great because you have something customized. But there will be a time to market because you're not dealing with a vendor who knows this inside out. And if you do decide to build something internally, there has to be, an immense amount of time that's given to the stakeholder or the main drivers of the program to really, before you start even delving into user requirements or building a target state, there can be anywhere upwards to 12 to 18 months, just understanding what the process is and understanding like what you don't know, right? And then building really like a current state picture to get to a target state. So that's really the one case study I'd like to share, right? Which ultimately describes, again, automated a corporate actions platform internally. The second one is where we were moving from a legacy vendor platform to the more strategic platform. So ultimately, the great thing about this is that you're dealing with a vendor who knows this inside out. And ultimately, the biggest, asset to that or return on investment is the ability to plug and play. And you don't lose all that time trying to figure out what you don't know. And so really the lessons learned there was making sure that despite, the subject matter expertise internally within the program and the vendor, is that there is enough amount of time or a significant amount of time that is given to the project managers across operations and technology to really perform capacity resource planning so that operations and technology have a very realistic time for building user story requirements, solutioning, development, and in testing to ensure that they are establishing and publishing a realistic expectation or a realistic timeline for completion of the corporate action automation project, right? Because oftentimes, these timelines are established, leveraging estimates that were published way before, corporate actions project has begun, probably during like a capital planning and budget phase. And as we all know, those estimates and timelines can be quite ambitious. So with that, I think, obviously, the vendor solution is a great one because quicker time to market. But there are some things that, need to be considered, especially when you're bringing, external and internal counterparties together and giving them enough time to really work through in a very realistic way the time that it takes to do some of the fundamental steps when building out the project plan and requirements.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for that. Indeed. Thank you. We only have time for a couple of comments now. So if I might come first to Maureen, what advice would you give to people working on corporate actions? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, the double mute button. I would leave everyone with 3 quick pieces of advice. 1, making sure that you have a data quality and governance process across the board from start to finish. Really understanding your data sources and what's driving where, and I think that ties directly to the data governance process. And that consistency of event details across your workflows. You can have multiple sources, but really bringing them together so you have consistency and you're not remediating against your own internal sources is critical. So those would be the 3 pieces that I would leave everyone with.
Okay, and a last word from you, Neil.
Yeah, so it's do your research, absolutely work with a vendor who understands your business, take care of your data capture, and do not underestimate the need for solid requirements at the beginning. And to Yodit's point, make sure that you manage that project very strictly indeed. PMO, that's the key. Okay, that's my kind of advice outside of the automation piece.
Okay, thank you. And
Okay.
thank you very much to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience today. Thank you too to Bloomberg and SmartStream for sponsoring today's webinar. It's been an interesting conversation. Before we close up, just a few 18 group items that may be of interest to you. If you scroll down your screen to additional options, you can download our ESG Handbook 2020-21. That's a bit weird, isn't it? 2021, as well as our latest regulatory data handbook that looks into 2021 and 2022. You can also register for our next data management summit, which we'll host in London and in person, hopefully in May 2022. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Maureen, Neil, Tom, Kerry and Yadit. And thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.